Thank you for inviting us to speak here at the International Solid Waste Management event about the American experience in overcoming the challenges of waste management that face the United States. Our two nations share much in common, so discussions such as these are natural to be having. What I refer to as the modern era of waste management in the U.S. really is not very old. There is an old saying that is attributed to former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill that Americans will always do the right thing only after they have tried everything else. Today, it is easy to forget that the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA as we call it for short, was established less than 50 years ago. Even after it was founded, it took several years to even begin addressing the issue of open dumps. In less than 30 years, however, the U.S. has been able to go from approximately 20,000 open dumps to about 2,000 regional sanitary landfills. They were able to do this while also achieving economic and regulatory stability for the waste management sector. I'm going to give a brief overview of what led to the creation of the EPA, the history of waste management legislation and regulation in the U.S., and our regulatory process that enables our industry to have a say in how the rules are shaped and applied to us. The roots of the environmental movement that spawned the EPA go back to 1962. When Rachel Carson's book Silent Spring was published. The book presented a critical look at pollution in the United States. Carson was a bird watcher who discovered that heavy use of pesticides was killing off birds and making the forests silent. She also wrote about harmful chemicals used for defoliation in the Vietnam War. 7 years later, in 1969, the Cuyahoga River in Ohio was so polluted that it caught on fire. Think about that for a minute, a river catching on fire. This spurred water pollution control activities, such as the Clean Water Act, and was one of the events that led to the creation of the Federal Environmental Protection Agency. In 1970, President Nixon signed the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. This law formed the Council on Environmental Quality to advise the President on the environment and review federal agencies' decision-makings when it comes to environmental impact statements that are required for projects that would affect the environment. By now, the environmental movement had gained momentum, and on April 22, 1970, the first Earth Day was held. More than 20 million Americans participated in one of the largest grassroots community service movements in the nation's history. The EPA was officially established on December 2nd of that year, consolidating several federal agencies into a single body that would be responsible for federal research, monitoring, standard setting, and enforcement activities to ensure environmental protection. EPA's mission was established to protect human health by safeguarding the air we breathe, the water we drink, and the land on which we live. Less than a month later, Congress authorized the EPA to set national air quality, auto emission, and anti-pollution standards. Over the next 2 years, Congress and the EPA took action on air and water pollution. In 1971, EPA announced national standards on 6 common pollutants, 4 years ahead of the regulation deadline set by the Clean Air Act. The following year, Congress passed the Clean Water Act to restore and maintain U.S. waters by preventing pollution, providing assistance to publicly owned wastewater treatment facilities, and maintaining the integrity of wetlands. Congress also passed the Ocean Dumping Act to reduce ocean water pollution. Within 3 years, EPA denied 70 contracts, many of them for chemical dumping. At this point, the focus shifted to educating the public about the importance of cleaning up the environment. In 1974, the EPA teamed up with the General Mills Corporation to educate young children about the environment. General Mills distributed over 60 million copies of an EPA-created children's book by packaging the learning tool in kids' cereal boxes. In 1976, Congress passed the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, something that Darrell spoke of earlier. We call it RCRA for short. It gave the EPA authority to control hazardous waste from the cradle to grave, including the generation, transportation, treatment, storage, and disposal of harmful materials. This did not, however, address the disposal of non-hazardous solid waste. 8 years later, in 1984, Congress passed amendments to RCRA establishing requirements governing generators, transporters, and disposers of small quantities of hazardous materials who had not generally been subject to full regulation under the law. These also mandated that land disposal of hazardous waste be banned unless EPA determines that the prohibition of such disposal is not necessary to protect human health and the environment. It was not until 1988 that Congress banned the ocean dumping of sewage, sludge, and industrial waste. So this picture looks very familiar to something that we just saw in the opening video. Despite all this progress, open dumps were still the norm in the U.S. more than 20 years after the EPA was founded. It was not even until 1991, 15 years after RCRA was established, that the law was expanded to regulate non-hazardous solid waste. This was the turning point in moving the U.S. from a culture that accepted open dumps to one that required sanitary landfills. It is safe to say that without this federal regulation, that the transition would have taken much longer. Regulations established under Subtitle D of RCRA banned open dumping of waste and set minimum federal criteria for the operation of municipal waste and industrial waste landfills, including design criteria, location restrictions, financial assurance, corrective actions such as cleanup, and closure requirements. States play a lead role in implementing these regulations and may set more stringent requirements. In the absence of an approved state program, the federal requirements must be met by waste facilities. This provided for a certain amount of standardization for waste transport across state lines and disposal, allowing for use of larger regional landfills that have the added benefit of providing economies of scale to reduce costs. Not long after the U.S. began its move away from open dumps, EPA Administrator William Riley, no relation of mine, led the U.S. delegation to the 1992 United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, or Earth Summit, in Rio de Janeiro. The event is viewed as a diplomatic breakthrough and opened up the possibility of a new era of serious environmental stewardship coupled with global economic growth. That same year, New York City was the last U.S. city to dump sewage at sea, stopping as a result of its agreement with the EPA under the Ocean Dumping Ban Act of 1988. By the end of 1995, the EPA issued requirements that municipal waste combustors, incinerators that burn household and commercial waste, reduce toxic emissions by 90% from 1990 levels. About 90% of municipal waste combustors are waste-to-energy plants that generate electricity or steam from burning garbage for commercial and residential use. Now I will turn to the federal rulemaking process in the U.S. that has helped to achieve economic and regulatory stability for the waste and management sector. When federal agencies issue regulations, they must first go through a regimented rulemaking process. This ensures transparency and gives members of the public the opportunity to provide input on the content of the rules. Our industry is currently engaged in several rulemakings at this time, ranging from an exemption from the use of electronic logging devices to monitor the number of hours drivers are behind the wheel, to what the definition is of a joint employer. The major steps in the federal rulemaking process are: 1, passage of enabling legislation. Before a federal agency can issue rules, it must have the statutory authority to do so. The U.S. Congress often passes laws directing federal agencies to issue regulations. Such a law gives the agency a general policy direction, but leaves the details to expert public administrators. In addition to working within the scope of this enabling legislation, agencies also must abide by the Administrative Procedures Act, which governs federal rulemaking. The bureaucrats writing regulations may only enact rules within the statutory authority granted to them by Congress. These administrative laws allow regular citizens to have a greater influence on regulations that could directly impact them. Citizens are given opportunities to propose rule language and comment on the language that agencies put forth. After the rulemaking process is over, however, Congress can still question agency leaders on the decisions they make in the rulemaking process. 2, regulatory planning. Federal agencies are required to produce rulemaking planning documents. These documents give notice to the public on upcoming rulemaking activities. Agencies produce a regulatory plan each year in the fall and an agenda of regulatory and deregulatory activities in the fall and spring. Together, they are called the Unified Agenda. 3, engaging stakeholders. Regulations cannot be made in a vacuum. To improve regulations and to mitigate the risk of them being challenged in court, agencies engage interested parties, or stakeholders as they are sometimes called, in the rulemaking process. They can do this formally and informally. Agencies informally engage stakeholders by contacting those they know and gathering their input before rules are drafted and during drafting. To engage stakeholders formally, agencies post an advance notice of proposed rulemaking in our Federal Register. The notice begins the comment process before the standard public comment period that occurs once rules are proposed. 4, the proposal. After researching the issue at hand and soliciting input from stakeholders, federal employees charged with writing rules get to work. After all the appropriate levels of agency management approve the proposed rules, the agency submits a notice of proposed rulemaking to the Federal Register. The notice has several parts. It has a summary. This is a statement describing the issue the proposed rules addresses and how the rule addresses the issue. It has dates, the date when the public comment period closes, has addresses the methods by which a citizen or group may comment on the proposed rules, and supplementary information, which is a discussion of the benefits of the proposed rule, key data and other information used in rulemaking, and an explanation of public policy choices made and citation of legal authority to enact the proposed rule. 5th is public comment. The public comment period gives citizens and interested groups the opportunity to make known their opinions about a proposed rule. Ideally, most people and groups inclined to comment on a proposed rule would have been engaged by the agency before the proposal. Even the best possible efforts, however, to engage stakeholders will not reach all potential commenters. So the public comment period is critical to the rulemaking process. Comment periods typically run for 30 to 60 days, but sometimes comment periods have been more than 180 days. More extended comment periods are given for very complex rules. Agencies prefer to receive comments through their online systems, which help them to keep track of the comments. If an agency receives significant comments about a proposed rule, it may revise the rules considering the comments and must repropose the rules. Revisions are not required if the agency still believes it is headed in the right direction with the rules. However, the agency will likely revise the rules in some way. The agency justifies the policy positions it takes in the subsequent proposal. The agency may also repropose it if it is not satisfied with the quality of the comments it receives in the original comment period. It would not revise the rules for the subsequent proposal if it simply desires more comments. 6, the final rule. Once the rule has been proposed, commented on, and revised as necessary, it is ready to be published as a final rule. What agencies propose in the Federal Register for the final rule is very similar to the notice of proposed rulemaking. The effective date for the rules replaces the deadline for submitting comments. This date is usually within 30 days of publishing the final rule. The agency also responds to major criticisms in the supplementary information section. This helps the public understand the agency's reasons behind the revisions it made to the proposed rule and why it did not incorporate some comments. I'm now going to turn things over to my colleague, Anne Germain, to discuss the more technical aspects of how this impacts the waste industry in practical application in real-life circumstances. Anne?